Like I said, his economic policies would eventually fail. However, before this could happen, or before really anything in his presidency could happen, Egypt, along with Syria, launched the October War in 1972. This was also known as the Yom Kippur War in Israel. It was a surprise attack to regain part of the Sinai territory Israel had captured 6 years earlier in the Six Days War, and it presented Sadat with the opportunity to win a victory that allowed him to regain the Sinai or generate some kind of peace treaty between Israel, perhaps even completing Nasser's pan-Arab movement. However, it was unsuccessful. Israel repelled the attack, and it was another violent and bloody war. And after this another military failure, which would have vast, vast success in years to come in 1979, but at the time it was considered a failure, and he returned to Egypt implementing his economic policies. Now, even though Sadat's policy was intended to modernize Egypt and assist its middle class, it mainly benefited the higher class. It aligned itself with U.S. industrialism. It helped outsource things from Egypt, helped form a larger economic portion with the West. That's why he changed the allegiance from Russia to the West when he first became president. And because of this elimination of subsidies on basic foodstuffs, because the economy just wasn't there, it was all outsourced. It was all going to the higher up, and no money was trickling down. It led to the 1977 Egyptian bread riots. However, Sadat would not allow this to ruin his presidency, even though it technically did, because he made a historic visit to Israel in the same year, hopefully to get the world stage to look more at what he was doing and not at the vast economic disparity of his country. And this visit ultimately led to the 1979 peace treaty in exchange for Israel to withdraw from the Sinai. It was signed at Camp David with President Carter. It was an incredibly famous meeting. And it pretty much initiated an enormous controversy in the Arab world. I mean, it was the opposite of what Nasser had wanted. It was the opposite of the pan-Arabism movement that he was trying to start. And nobody really agreed with it. Nobody liked it. The West, his new allegiance, they liked it. It was a progressive step to modernizing Egypt. Everybody thought really highly of it, except for Egypt and the Arab world. In fact, so much so that Egypt was expelled from the Arab League, uh, and Sadat was assassinated by an Islamic extremist in October of 1981. Now, the lower classes in Egypt, the middle classes, and the normal civilians, not the people in government, not the people in politics, generally supported Sadat's ultimate decision for a peace treaty with Israel. They wanted the Sinai back. They didn't want to continue Nasser's aggressive stance with Israel to further more loss of life. They were happy. It was, again, the higher up, the economic first class that wasn't happy, the Islamic extremists that weren't happy, and the people who were heavily into Nasser's pan-Arabism that were unhappy, and ultimately led to his death. This would lead to his military counterpart, essentially what Sadat was to Nasser, Hosni Mubarak was to Sadat, and that's in picture there in 1981 alongside Sadat in his military uniform. He came to power after the assassination of Sadat in a referendum in which he was the only candidate. It was basically a military takeover of the government, but democratically, so to speak. During his long presidency that lasted from 1981 to 2011, his administration dealt with a massive rise in terrorism. In response to this, Mubarak cracked down on all forms of Muslim extremism, issuing out secret police and military police. This was because organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and more extreme ones were trying to repeal what Sadat had done before, was trying to get back into the Arab world. Things were very violent. They targeted Western tourism. The West, one of the things that prompted Mubarak to take such a harsh stand was perhaps the historic terror attack in the city of Luxor in 1997, in which 62 Western tourists were massacred by one of these terrorist groups that were gunned down. And so he began, and this attack was not just on extremism. I want to stress that it was not just on terrorists. He cracked down on every form of outspoken religious movements in the country, peaceful, benign. It didn't matter. He could detain people without question. His government really became one of fear and terror. I mean, he fought terrorism with terror. It was a terrible time in Egypt, but perhaps one that a lot of people felt needed to happen to secure its safety. However, the Human Rights Watch in 2006 reported that Egypt detailed serious human rights violations. It said that he committed routine torture, arbitrary detentions, trials that had no court. They were just sentencings, basically. He handled executions on his own. He could say anything and it would happen. It was a bunch of crimes against humanity he was found guilty of. 2007, the Amnesty International released a report alleging that Egypt had become an international center for torture, showing that Mubarak's government not only attacked people in Egypt, but allowed other countries to bring in their possible terrorists or criminals or just people they wanted to get rid of, and they would be tortured, interrogated, and or executed inside of Egypt's border. All these interrogations, he said, were part, again, on the war on terror. He wanted to make Egypt more secure and found it completely necessary and legal. However, the Egyptians did not, the rest of the world did not. In fact, it was kind of a tyrannical dictatorship. It was a very dangerous and scary regime, which would fall apart on January 25th, 2011, part of the massive Arab Spring movement. During this time, all the Arab nations that you saw from Pan-Arabism, the thing Nasser had fought for, were now fighting against all these Cold War-style pseudo-presidential regimes in an attempt to gain a kind of more realistic independence, a government where they no longer were controlled by dictators, but by the people. So it all went in steps for the Arab world, and the leader of the Arab world, Egypt, was no exception. From British protectorate to military dictatorships, this Arab Spring was meant to put it now into the hands of the people. Widespread protests began against Mubarak's government in Cairo at this time, and they got so bad that on February 11th of the same year, little less than a month later, he fled Cairo, fled Egypt, denouncing his presidency. He resigned. There were jubilant celebrations that his reign was over. They broke out in Cairo's Tahrir Square. The Egyptian military was there to kind of keep order, and everybody thought it was a great victory for them. However, the military then immediately assumed power to govern. Mohammed Hussein Tawal, chairman of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, became the de facto interim head of state. On February 13th, 2 days later, the military dissolved parliament and suspended the constitution, stating martial law. Since then, there has been several presidents backed by the military, the Muslim Brotherhood, the people, random factions, and all have served short terms before being disposed, leaving Egypt in this very unstable post-revolution state. And just recently, I think it was this May, I'm not real sure, in a televised speech, the current president, or most recent president, military leader Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, warned Egyptians that they lived in a broken country surrounded by enemies who would never leave them alone, perhaps citing the West, the other Arab nations, Israel, or just all those things combined. He said, take a good look at your country. This is the semblance of a state and not a real state, implying that Egypt was not the real big state that it had been. It was not what Nasser had wanted. Instead, it was this broken, fractured government and system. He said Egypt needed law and order and strong institutions to reverse its downward spiral and become a state that respects itself and respected by the world. In a recent poll, Egyptian citizens on a whole agreed with this assessment, and hopefully looking toward the future, the government will stabilize once again and become a strong member of the Arab world. once more and will further into democracy and lead Egypt into a whole nother realm of new and possibilities of modernization. And that concludes my presentation on Egypt's independence. Thank you.